Hi, I'm Darian Holtcrest. For 8 years, my wife's family treated me like I was beneath them. They called me worthless at every family gathering, seated me at the back table during holidays, and made it clear I'd never be good enough for their precious daughter. They whispered behind my back, excluded me from family meetings, and acted like I was contaminating their bloodline just by breathing the same air. But here's what they didn't know. When the family lawyer called me into his office last Tuesday, he didn't just read me a will. He revealed a secret that shattered everything I thought I knew about my in-laws. The couple who spent nearly a decade making me feel worthless had left me their entire fortune. Every property, every investment, every cent. But what the lawyer told me next about why they did it didn't just shock me. It exposed a real reason they treated me the way they did all these years. Want to know how their hatred was actually love in disguise? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I met Roic and Muriel Calvain, I was covered in mud and blood, and their daughter Celia was crying in my arms. It was 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and I'd just pulled her from an overturned car on Highway 47 outside Thornfield. The accident had happened so fast. A drunk driver had clipped her sedan and sent it spinning into the drainage ditch. When I found her, she was trapped upside down, fuel leaking everywhere, and nobody else had stopped. I was driving home from my night shift at Brennan's manufacturing plant when I saw the headlights pointing up at the sky instead of down the road. Most people would have called 911 and waited. I couldn't do that. I'd lost my younger brother in a car accident 5 years earlier because help arrived too late. The memory of sitting in that hospital waiting room, being told they'd done everything they could, still woke me up some nights. So when I saw Celia's car, I didn't hesitate. The passenger door was jammed, but the driver's side had an opening just big enough for me to squeeze through. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, and I could hear her whimpering from inside. She was conscious but disoriented, hanging upside down in her seatbelt with a gash on her forehead bleeding steadily. Her left arm was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn, but she was alive. "Hey, can you hear me?" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm while my hands shook. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay still, okay?" "I can't feel my legs," she whispered, and I felt my heart drop. But I'd seen enough workplace accidents to know that shock could cause temporary numbness. The important thing was getting her out before the car caught fire or shifted deeper into the ditch. I managed to cut her seatbelt with a utility knife from my toolbox and carefully extract her from the wreckage. She was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'4", with dark hair matted with blood and dirt. Her dress was torn and muddy, but she was breathing steadily. I carried her up the embankment and laid her gently on the grass beside the road, using my jacket to keep her warm while we waited for the ambulance. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep her conscious and talking. "Celia," she managed. "Celia DeMar. Well, Calvain now, I just got married last month." I felt a strange pang at that information, though I couldn't explain why. "I'm Darian Holtcrest. You're going to be fine, Celia. The paramedics are on their way." She looked up at me with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in the car. "You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Most people would have been afraid. You weren't." When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed that her injuries weren't as severe as they'd initially appeared. A broken arm, some cuts and bruises, and a mild concussion, but no spinal damage. She'd been incredibly lucky. As they loaded her into the ambulance, she insisted that I follow them to Thornfield General Hospital. "I need to call my parents," she said. "They should meet you." I tried to explain that it wasn't necessary, that I was just glad she was safe, but she wouldn't hear it. "Please," she said, "they need to know what you did." So I followed the ambulance to the hospital, still wearing my work clothes, stained with mud and her blood. I waited in the emergency room for 3 hours, drinking terrible coffee from a vending machine and calling my supervisor to explain why I wouldn't be making it to my morning shift. Around 6 a.m., a man and woman in expensive clothing rushed through the automatic doors with the kind of urgency that comes from receiving a middle-of-the-night phone call about your newly married daughter. Roic Calvain was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. Muriel was elegant in a way that seemed effortless, wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. They both looked like they belonged in a different world than the fluorescent-lit hospital waiting room. They found me sitting near the reception desk, still in my stained work clothes, and approached cautiously. "Are you Darian Holtcrest?" Rowek asked, his voice carrying the subtle authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Yes, sir. Our daughter says you pulled her from her car." "The paramedics did the real work," I said, standing up. "I just happened to be driving by at the right time." Muriel studied me with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took in the mud on my jeans, the blood on my shirt, the calluses on my hands from years of factory work. I could see her making calculations, forming judgments, filing away details for future reference. "She says you risked your life to save hers," she said finally. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Rowek said, and for a moment his businessman's mask slipped, and I saw something that looked like genuine emotion. "Most people would have called for help and waited. You acted when action was needed. That takes courage." A doctor appeared before I could respond, and the conversation shifted to Celia's condition and treatment plan. The relief on her parents' faces when they learned she would make a full recovery was visible and raw. Muriel actually tears in her eyes, though she wiped them away quickly. When they finally let us see Celia, she was sitting up in bed with her arm in a cast and butterfly bandages on her forehead. She looked fragile against the white hospital sheets, but her smile was bright when she saw us. "Mom, Dad, this is Darian," she said, "the man who saved my life." Rowek shook my hand firmly. "We can never repay what you've done for our family." "There's nothing to repay," I insisted. "I'm just glad she's okay." But as I left the hospital that morning, I noticed the way Muriel looked at me. It wasn't gratitude exactly, or even approval. It was something more complex, like she was seeing me as a puzzle she needed to solve. I didn't understand it then, but that look would haunt me for years. 6 months later, Celia and I were engaged. A year after that, we were married in a ceremony at the Calvain family estate in Millbrook Heights, a mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from some European countryside. I proposed to her not because of that night, but because in the months that followed, I discovered that her courage in that overturned car was just a glimpse of who she really was. She was kind, intelligent, funny, and completely unpretentious despite growing up with wealth I couldn't imagine. But from the moment I said I do, everything changed. The gratitude her parents had shown me at the hospital vanished, replaced by a cold distance that gradually hardened into open contempt. It was as if saving their daughter's life had been a temporary pass into their world, and now that the crisis was over, I was expected to return to whatever lower social stratum I'd emerged from. I never understood why. I'd proven myself capable of action under pressure, shown that I valued their daughter's life above my own safety, and demonstrated the kind of character they claimed to respect. But somehow, none of that mattered once I became part of their family. The man who'd been a hero for one night became an embarrassment they had to tolerate for the next 8 years. What I didn't know then was that Rowek and Muriel Calvain were conducting their own investigation into exactly who I was and what I represented. They were watching, evaluating, testing me in ways I wouldn't understand until much later. And despite everything they put me through, despite the humiliation and the constant reminders that I wasn't good enough, they were reaching a conclusion that would shock everyone, including me. The night I pulled Celia from that wreckage, I thought I was just doing what any one decent person would do. I had no idea I was auditioning for the most important role of my life, or that the judgment of 2 people who seemed to despise me would ultimately determine my entire future. The first family dinner after Celia and I returned from our honeymoon set the tone for everything that would follow. We'd spent 2 weeks in Costa Rica, staying in a modest beach hotel that Celia had chosen specifically because she wanted us to have something that felt like ours, rather than something her parents had paid for. It was the happiest I'd ever been, waking up next to this incredible woman who somehow saw past my factory worker background to whatever potential she believed I had. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That happiness lasted exactly until we walked through the mahogany doors of the Calvain family estate for Sunday dinner. The dining room at Millbrook Heights was designed to intimidate. 20-foot ceilings, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my annual salary, and a table that could seat 14 people comfortably. Oil paintings of Calvain ancestors gazed down from the walls with expressions of perpetual judgment, as if they were personally disappointed in whoever happened to be eating beneath them. Celia's brother Theodore was already seated when we arrived, along with his wife Alaya and their twin teenagers. Theodore worked in the family's investment firm and had the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. Alaya was from old money, too, with that specific brand of politeness that could cut you to ribbons while never raising her voice. "Well, well," Theodore said as we took our seats. "The newlyweds return. How was the honeymoon? Stay somewhere with room service this time?" It was a reference to our engagement trip to a cabin upstate, where I'd insisted on cooking our meals instead of eating at expensive restaurants every night. To me, it had been romantic. To Theodore, it was evidence of my fundamental inability to appreciate the finer things in life. "It was perfect," Celia said firmly, squeezing my hand under the table. Muriel entered wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, her silver hair perfectly styled, despite being nearly 60. She kissed Celia's cheek and nodded politely in my direction. "Darian," she said, as if my name tasted slightly unpleasant in her mouth. "I trust you're settling into married life well." "Yes, ma'am. Celia and I are very happy." "Of course you are," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Celia has always been generous with her affections." The comment landed like a small knife between my ribs. Generous with her affections. As if my wife's love for me was charity she was dispensing to the less fortunate. Rowick appeared a moment later, imposing in his navy suit despite being in his own home. He took his seat at the head of the table and surveyed the room like a general reviewing his troops. "Theodore tells me the Berkshire acquisition is moving forward smoothly," he said, launching immediately into business talk that excluded me completely. For the next 20 minutes, the family discussed investments, property developments, and social obligations, using a vocabulary of wealth that might as well have been a foreign language. I tried to follow along, occasionally asking questions that were met with patient explanations delivered in the tone one might use with a curious but dim student. When I mentioned that I was considering taking night classes in business administration, Alaya actually laughed. "How ambitious," she said, "though I suppose formal education can't replace instinct. Some people are born understanding money, and others—" She shrugged elegantly, leaving the sentence unfinished. The maids served dinner on china that looked museum quality, and I found myself carefully watching how everyone else held their forks and used their napkins. At home, Celia and I ate off regular plates and didn't worry about which glass was for water and which was for wine. Here, every gesture felt like it was being evaluated for signs of my working-class origins. "Darian," Rowick said during the main course, "Celia mentioned you're still working at the manufacturing plant." "Yes, sir. I'm actually up for a supervisor position next month." "How? Steady," Muriel said. "Though I imagine the hours must be difficult. All that overnight work." "I don't mind it. The pay is good, and it gives me flexibility for the business classes I'm planning to take." "Of course," Theodore said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Though I have to ask, don't you think Celia deserves better than coming home to an empty house while you're working the graveyard shift?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Celia, who was staring at her brother with barely concealed anger. "Theodore," she said warningly. "I'm just saying," he continued. "Marriage is about partnership, about building something together. I'm not sure how much building can happen when one partner is." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "When one partner is what?" I asked, setting down my fork. "Well, limited in terms of resources and connections." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the heat rising in my face, but I forced myself to remain calm. Getting angry would only confirm their opinion that I didn't belong at their table. "I may not have your resources," I said carefully, "but I love your sister, and I'll do whatever it takes to build a good life with her." "Love," Aliyah said with a slight smile. "How romantic." Though romance doesn't pay for private schools or country club memberships, or the kind of lifestyle Celia grew up with. "Maybe those things aren't as important as you think they are," I replied. The look that passed between Rowick and Muriel was swift but unmistakable. I'd just revealed my fundamental misunderstanding of their world. In their universe, private schools and country club memberships weren't luxuries. They were necessities. They were the infrastructure that supported their family's position in society. "Of course they're important," Muriel said gently, as if explaining something obvious to someone particularly slow. "They're how we maintain the standards that have served our family for generations. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation and subtle corrections. When I mentioned enjoying a baseball game on TV, Theodore launched into a monologue about the superior strategy and tradition of polo. When I talked about a book I'd been reading, Elia recommended several authors I'd never heard of, available at any decent library. By the time we left, I felt like I'd been dissected by a team of very polite surgeons. Every word I'd spoken, every gesture I'd made, had been catalogued as evidence of my unsuitability for their family. "They'll come around," Celia said in the car afterward, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. They didn't come around. If anything, they got worse. Over the next 8 years, every family gathering became an exercise in humiliation disguised as inclusion. Birthday parties where I was introduced as Celia's husband without my name. Holiday dinners where I was seated at the far end of the table, literally at the kids' table until Celia's nephews outgrew it. Business discussions that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, followed by awkward transitions to topics deemed more suitable for my comprehension level. The worst part wasn't the big moments of exclusion, it was the constant drip of small humiliations. Muriel asking if I needed directions to the country club when they invited us to events there, as if I couldn't possibly be familiar with their social venues. Rawick explaining basic financial concepts to me in front of other guests, treating me like a student rather than a son-in-law. Theodore making jokes about working with your hands whenever my job came up in conversation. They never said anything directly cruel. They were too sophisticated for obvious attacks. Instead, they mastered the art of the backhanded compliment, the loaded question, the suggestion disguised as concern. "We just want to make sure Celia is happy. We hope you're not feeling overwhelmed by all this. It must be such an adjustment coming from such a different background." The most painful moments came when I could see how much it hurt Celia. She'd defend me fiercely, but I could see the toll it took on her relationships with her family. She started declining invitations to family events, making excuses to avoid the constant tension. But that only made things worse, because then I became the reason she was pulling away from the people who'd raised her. Maybe they'd respect me more if I made more money, I told her one night after a particularly brutal family dinner where Rawick had spent 20 minutes explaining why my investment ideas were naive. "It's not about money," Celia said, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. So I worked harder. I took those night classes and earned a business degree. I got promoted to supervisor, then department manager. I started a small consulting business on the side, helping other manufacturing companies improve their efficiency. I bought Celia a nicer car, a bigger house, jewelry that sparkled the way I thought her family expected. None of it mattered. No matter how much I achieved or how successful I became, I was still the factory worker who'd gotten lucky enough to marry above his station. I was still the outsider who'd somehow convinced their precious daughter to lower her standards. What I didn't understand was that my success wasn't invisible to them. Every promotion, every achievement, every sign that I was more than they'd initially assumed was being carefully noted and filed away. They were watching me with the same intensity they'd shown that night in the hospital, but for reasons I couldn't begin to imagine. And while they continued to treat me like an unwelcome guest at their family table, they were secretly making preparations that would change everything. Plans that would transform 8 years of humiliation into the most shocking vindication of my life. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, while I was reviewing production reports in my office at Brennan's Manufacturing. I'd been promoted to operations manager 2 years earlier, overseeing 3 departments and 97 employees. It was the kind of job I'd once thought was beyond my reach, but I'd learned that competence and persistence could sometimes overcome the limitations of background and education. Celia's voice was shaking when she called. "Darian, you need to come home. Something's happened." My first thought was that someone had broken into our house. My second was that she'd been in another accident. The memory of pulling her from that overturned car 8 years earlier was never far from my mind, and it flared up whenever she sounded distressed. "Are you hurt? Are you safe?" "I'm fine, but—" She paused, and I could hear her trying to control her breathing. "It's my father. He collapsed at the office this morning. They're saying it was a massive heart attack." I was already reaching for my keys. "Which hospital?" "Thornfield General. Darian, they don't think—" Her voice broke completely. "They don't think he's going to make it." I drove to the hospital faster than I should have, my mind racing through a dozen different scenarios. Raoul Calvin had always seemed indestructible to me, like a force of nature disguised as a businessman. He was only 64, in seemingly perfect health, with a kind of confident energy that suggested he expected to live forever. The idea that his body could simply betray him felt impossible. I found Celia in the cardiac intensive care unit waiting room, surrounded by her family but somehow looking completely alone. Theodore was pacing near the windows, his usual composure cracked and showing the frightened son underneath. Elia sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Muriel was in a chair beside Celia, holding her daughter's hand and staring at the floor with an expression I'd never seen before. When Celia saw me, she stood up and walked straight into my arms. She didn't care that her family was watching, didn't worry about maintaining the social distance they usually preferred. She just held on to me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. "How is he?" I asked. "Stable, but barely," Theodore said without looking at me. "The doctors are saying the next 72 hours will be critical." I guided Celia back to her chair and sat beside her, keeping one arm around her shoulders. For the first time in 8 years, her family didn't seem to notice or care about my presence. Their attention was entirely focused on the door that led to the ICU, where Roic was fighting for his life. The hours that followed were a strange kind of suspended animation. Doctors appeared periodically with updates that were either cautiously optimistic or carefully neutral. Family friends stopped by to offer support and ask if there was anything they could do. Business associates called Theodore's phone constantly, requiring updates on decisions that couldn't wait for the crisis to pass. I stayed because Celia needed me there, but I also stayed because I realized I was seeing her family in a way I'd never seen them before. Without their patriarch's commanding presence, without the social rituals that usually defined their interactions, they were just frightened people, facing the possibility of devastating loss. Muriel, who had spent 8 years treating me with polite disdain, actually accepted the coffee I brought her from the vending machine. Theodore, who usually couldn't be bothered to acknowledge my contributions to family conversations, found himself sitting next to me during the long waits and talking about memories of his father. "He taught me to drive in the parking lot behind his first office building," Theodore said during one of these unguarded moments. "I was 12, could barely reach the pedals, but he insisted I needed to understand how machinery worked. Control comes from understanding," he used to say. "He sounds like he was a good teacher," I said. Theodore looked at me with something that might have been surprise. He was, demanding but fair. He never accepted anything less than your best effort. It was the first real conversation Theodore and I had ever had, and it happened because his father was dying in a room 30 feet away. On the second day, while Celia was sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair and the rest of the family had gone home to shower and change clothes, I found myself alone in the waiting room with Muriel. She'd been there for almost 36 hours straight, maintaining her vigil with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "I know this isn't easy for you." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me, and it caught me off guard. "Celia needs me here," I replied. "Yes," she said, studying my face, "she does." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the constant background noise of the hospital. Monitors beeping, nurses talking in hushed voices, the occasional announcement over the intercom. Finally, Muriel spoke again. "You know, when Celia first brought you home after the accident, Raoul and I were prepared to be grateful and move on. We thought you'd accept our thanks, maybe stay in touch for a while, and then fade back into whatever life you'd been living before." I turned to look at her, surprised by the admission. "But you didn't fade," she continued. "You kept showing up. You pursued our daughter with this intensity that we didn't understand. We kept waiting for you to realize that you were out of your depth, that you didn't belong in our world." "Maybe I don't belong in your world," I said. "That's what we thought too," she said. "That's what we've been telling ourselves for 8 years. Before I could ask what she meant, a doctor appeared in the doorway. Dr. Pemberton was the cardiac surgeon who'd been overseeing Rowick's care, a serious man with kind eyes who'd been giving us updates every few hours. "Mrs. Calvin," he said, "your husband is awake and asking for you." Muriel stood up so quickly that she swayed slightly, and I instinctively reached out to steady her. She looked at my hand on her arm, then at my face, with an expression I couldn't read. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time in 8 years it sounded genuine. We woke Celia and gathered the family for what we thought might be our final conversation with Rauik. The ICU was a maze of machines and monitors, all focused on keeping him alive. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, diminished by the tubes and wires that connected him to life support. But his eyes were alert when we entered the room, and his voice, though weak, carried hints of his old authority. "Theodore," he said, "I need you to handle the Morrison account personally. Don't delegate it." "Dad, we can talk about business later." "No," Rauik interrupted. "We'll talk about it now, while I can still think clearly." For the next 20 minutes, he dispensed instructions and advice with the focused intensity of a general preparing for battle. He talked to Theodore about business strategies, to Alaya about the twins, education, to Celia about investments and property management. Then he looked at me. "Darian," he said, "come closer." I approached the bed cautiously, aware that the entire family was watching. Rauik studied my face with the same analytical attention he'd always given to business problems. "8 years ago, you saved my daughter's life," he said. "Yes, sir. And every day since then, you've continued to save it in ways you probably don't even realize." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. "I want you to know," he continued, his voice growing even quieter, "that we've been watching, paying attention. And what we've seen—" He paused, struggling to find the words. "What we've seen has surprised us." Before I could ask what he meant, the machines around his bed started beeping frantically. Nurses rushed in, followed by Dr. Pemberton, and we were quickly ushered out of the room. Rauik Calvane died 47 minutes later at 3:23 a.m. on a Thursday morning, with his family gathered in the waiting room just outside his door. The last words he'd spoken to me echoed in my mind as we sat in stunned silence, trying to process the reality that this larger-than-life man was simply gone. "We've been watching, what we've seen has surprised us." I had no idea what he meant, but something in the way he'd said it suggested that my 8 years of humiliation might have been building toward something I couldn't imagine. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about my place in the Calvane family. The funeral was everything I'd expected from the Calvane family: elegant, expensive, and overwhelming in its display of social connections. St. Margaret's Cathedral was filled with business leaders, politicians, and society figures who spoke about Rauik's integrity, his vision, and his commitment to family values. I sat in the front row beside Celia, wearing my best suit and feeling like an imposter among the genuine mourners. The eulogy Theodore delivered was perfect, heartfelt but controlled, personal but appropriate for public consumption. He talked about their father's business acumen, his devotion to family, and his belief that success meant nothing without character to support it. What struck me most was a line near the end. "My father always said that a man's true worth isn't measured by what he inherits, but by what he builds with his own hands." It felt like a message aimed directly at me, though I couldn't understand why. After the service, the family gathered at Millbrook Heights for a reception that felt more like a board meeting than a wake. Business associates approached Theodore with urgent matters that couldn't wait. Investment advisors spoke in hushed tones with Muriel about portfolio management and estate planning. Celia moved through the crowd, accepting condolences with the kind of gracious composure her mother had taught her. I found myself standing near the windows that overlooked the estate's gardens, holding a glass of wine I wasn't drinking and trying to stay out of everyone's way. That's where Ezra Morrow found me. "Mr. Holtcrest," he said, approaching with the measured gait of someone carrying important information. "I'm Ezra Morrow, the family's attorney. I was wondering if I could have a word with you privately." Ezra was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of formal bearing that suggested he'd been handling wealthy families' affairs for decades. I'd seen him at family events over the years, but had never actually spoken with him. "Of course," I said, though I couldn't imagine what he wanted to discuss with me. He led me to Rauik's study, a room I'd only been in once before, when Celia had given me a tour of the house during our engagement. It was exactly as I remembered: leather-bound books, dark wood paneling, and a massive desk that seemed designed to intimidate anyone sitting across from it. Ezra closed the door behind us and gestured for me to take a seat in one of the chairs facing the desk. "I apologize for the timing," he said, settling into the chair behind the desk, "but given the circumstances, I felt it was important to speak with you before the formal reading of the will. I'm not sure I understand." He opened a leather portfolio and removed several documents. Mr. Calvin made some significant changes to his estate planning over the past few years. Changes that directly concern you. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. If this is about Celia's inheritance, I want you to know that I've never expected. Mr. Holtcrest, he interrupted gently, you've been named as the primary beneficiary of Rawik Calvain's estate. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, certain I'd misunderstood. I'm sorry, what did you say? The house, the business holdings, the investment portfolios, the property in Maine and California, it's all been left to you, with the exception of some specific bequests to other family members and charitable organizations. You are inheriting approximately $87 million. The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the arms of my chair and tried to process what he'd just told me. That's impossible, I said. He barely tolerated me. The family has spent 8 years making it clear that I don't belong. Ezra smiled sadly. That's what makes this so extraordinary, and so telling. He pulled out another document, this one handwritten in Rawik's distinctive script. He left you a letter, Ezra said. He asked me to read it to you personally, before the family learns about the inheritance. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Ezra cleared his throat and began to read. Darian, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain myself in person, and for that I'm sorry. I know the last 8 years have been difficult for you. I know my family has treated you with suspicion, and sometimes outright contempt. What you don't know is that every slight, every humiliation, every test we put you through was deliberate. When you pulled Celia from that car, you showed us something we hadn't seen in years. Someone who acted based on principle rather than calculation. Someone who risked their own safety for a stranger without expecting anything in return. We needed to know if that moment was who you really were, or just who you happened to be when circumstances demanded it. So we tested you. We made you feel unwelcome and watched to see if you'd fight for your place in our family or simply accept the rejection. We questioned your intelligence and observed how you responded to condescension. We excluded you from business discussions and noted whether you'd try to force your way in or focus on other ways to contribute. For 8 years, we watched you choose dignity over anger, persistence over pride, love for our daughter over your own comfort. We watched you work harder and achieve more, not to impress us, but to build a life worthy of the woman you married. We watched you weather our disapproval without becoming bitter or taking it out on Celia. Most importantly, we watched you prove that your character isn't dependent on how you're treated. You remained kind when we were cold, respectful when we were dismissive, committed when we made it clear you weren't wanted. That's not something that can be taught or faked. It's who you are. I'm leaving you my fortune because I believe you'll do something meaningful with it. Not because you need the money. Your business degree and consulting work have proven you're capable of creating your own success, but because you have the character to handle wealth responsibly. Theodore is brilliant, and Theodore will receive his own inheritance through his trust fund, but Theodore has never been tested the way you have. He's never had to prove his worth to anyone, never had to choose between taking the easy path and doing the right thing when those paths diverged. Celia will be provided for through separate accounts I've established for her, but she doesn't need my money to be happy. She needs a partner who values her for who she is rather than what she represents, and you've proven to be that partner every day for 8 years. Muriel fought me on this decision initially. She thought we were being unnecessarily cruel to you, that our testing had gone too far. But she came to understand, as I hope you will, that we needed to be absolutely certain. A fortune like this can destroy a person if they're not prepared for it, but it can also do tremendous good in the right hands. I'm trusting you with more than money, Darian. I'm trusting you with my family's future, with my daughter's happiness, with the responsibility to use these resources in ways that honor the values you've demonstrated over the past 8 years. I should have told you all of this while I was alive. I should have explained what we were doing and why. I should have let you know that your struggles weren't invisible, that your character wasn't unnoticed, that your place in our family was never actually in question. I hope you can forgive an old man's stubbornness and accept this inheritance with the understanding that it comes with complete confidence in your integrity. Welcome to the family, son. Officially, Rawik Calvain. Ezra finished reading and set the letter down on the desk. I sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what I'd just heard. He tested me, I said finally. For 8 years, he tested me. They both did, Ezra confirmed. Mrs. Calvane was part of the planning, though she had reservations about the methods. And the rest of the family? Theodore and Aaliyah knew nothing about this. They believed their behavior toward you reflected their parents' genuine feelings. I thought about all the humiliating dinners, all the condescending comments, all the times I'd wondered what I'd done wrong to deserve such treatment. None of it had been personal. It had all been an elaborate evaluation of my character. What happens now? I asked. Now we read the will to the family, Ezra said, and you get to decide what kind of man you want to be with $87 million. I looked around Rowick's study, at the books and awards and photographs that told the story of a life well lived. In a few minutes, I would walk back into that reception and everything would change. The family that had treated me like an unwelcome guest would learn that I was now their financial superior. The people who had questioned my worth would discover that their patriarch had found me worthy of his life's work. The question was, what was I going to do with that knowledge? The formal reading of the will took place in the library at Millbrook Heights, with the immediate family gathered around the mahogany conference table that Rowick had used for important business meetings. Celia sat beside me, still wearing her black dress from the funeral, her hand finding mine as we waited for Ezra to begin. Theodore and Aaliyah sat across from us, their faces showing the strain of the past week, but no indication that they expected anything unusual. Muriel took her place at the head of the table, in the chair that had been Rowick's during countless family discussions. She looked composed, but I caught her glancing at me with an expression I was only now beginning to understand. It wasn't disapproval or resignation, it was anticipation. Before we begin, Ezra said, opening his leather portfolio, I want to remind everyone that Mr. Calvane's instructions were very specific about how this information should be shared. Please hold your questions until I've finished reading the relevant sections. He began with the standard legal language, establishing the validity of the will and Rowick's mental competence when it was drafted. Then he moved to the specific bequests. To my son Theodore Marwin Calvane, I leave my collection of first edition books, my vintage automobile collection, and the sum of $5 million to be administered through the trust fund already established for his benefit. Theodore nodded, unsurprised. The trust fund Ezra mentioned had been providing him with a comfortable income since he turned 25. To my daughter-in-law Aaliyah Vork Calvane, I leave my wife's jewelry collection and the sum of $2 million, with my gratitude for the care she has shown our family. Aaliyah touched her throat automatically where she was wearing a simple pearl necklace that had belonged to Muriel's mother. To my daughter Celia Darian Holtcrest, I leave the property in Maine, the art collection, and the sum of $10 million to be held in a trust that provides her with complete financial independence for the rest of her life. Celia squeezed my hand. $10 million was more money than either of us had ever imagined having, but it seemed reasonable given the family's wealth. To my wife Muriel Drovane Calvane, I leave the property in California, our joint investment in Berkshire Holdings, and the sum of $15 million, along with my eternal love and gratitude for 43 years of partnership. Muriel's composure cracked slightly at the personal note, but she maintained her dignity. Then Ezra paused and looked directly at me. To my son-in-law Darian Marcus Holtcrest, I leave the family estate at Millbrook Heights, all business holdings of Calvane Enterprises, including subsidiaries and partnerships, all remaining investment portfolios, and the residue of my estate totaling approximately $57 million. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel Celia's hand trembling in mine, could sense Theodore and Elias staring at me with expressions of complete shock. I'm sorry, Theodore said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Did you say $57 million? That's correct, Ezra replied. Along with controlling interest in the family business and ownership of this property. That's not possible, Elias said, her composure finally cracking. There must be some mistake. Ezra continued reading without acknowledging the interruption. Furthermore, Mr. Calvane left specific instructions regarding the administration of these bequests. Mr. Holtcrest, you have the authority to modify or revoke any of the other bequests if you determine that the recipients are not acting in the best interests of the family. Now even Muriel looked surprised. This was apparently a detail she hadn't known about. What does that mean exactly? Theodore asked, his face flushing with anger. It means, Ezra explained, that Mr. Holtcrest has veto power over your inheritances, if he chooses to exercise it. The room erupted. Theodore stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. Elia began speaking rapidly about legal challenges and family obligations. Even Celia was staring at me with wide eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. But Muriel remained seated, watching me with the same analytical attention her husband had always shown when evaluating a business decision. "There's more," Ezra said, raising his voice slightly to regain control of the room. "Mr. Calvane also left a letter to be read aloud to the family." "I don't want to hear any more letters," Theodore said. "I want to understand how my father could leave our family business to someone who has no experience running a company, no understanding of our responsibilities, no—" "Theodore," I said quietly, and something in my tone made him stop mid-sentence. "Sit down." For a moment I thought he might refuse. The balance of power in the room had shifted so dramatically that none of us quite knew how to navigate it yet. But after a long pause, he picked up his chair and sat down. Ezra read Rowick's letter to the family, explaining the 8-year test they'd subjected me to and the reasoning behind his decision. When he finished, the silence was even more profound than before. "You knew," Celia said to her mother. "You knew they were testing him." "Not about the inheritance," Muriel replied. "That was your father's decision alone. But yes, I knew we were evaluating Darian's character." "For 8 years you made me watch my family treat my husband like he was worthless," Celia said, her voice rising. "You made me choose between defending him and maintaining peace with my own parents." "We had to know," Muriel said simply. "We had to be certain." Theodore stood up again, this time more slowly. "Well, congratulations, Darian. You've managed to manipulate your way into our family fortune. I hope you're proud of yourself." "Theodore," Elia warned, clearly recognizing that antagonizing me further might not be wise given my new position. But I stood up too, facing him across the table. "You think I manipulated this situation?" I asked. "What else would you call it?" "I'd call it 8 years of being treated like dirt by people who were supposedly my family, while working 60-hour weeks and going to school at night to try to earn your respect. I'd call it watching my wife suffer because her parents put her in an impossible position. I'd call it trying to build bridges that you burned as fast as I could construct them." "You didn't belong here," Theodore said. "You still don't belong here." "You're right," I said. "I don't belong in a family that treats people like obstacles to be overcome, rather than human beings to be valued. But apparently your father disagreed with you about what belonging actually means." I turned to Ezra. "What exactly are my legal obligations as the inheritor of the business?" "You have complete authority over Calvane Enterprises and its subsidiaries. You can make personnel changes, strategic decisions, even dissolve the company if you choose." Theodore's face went pale. "You wouldn't." "I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet," I said. "But I can tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to pretend that the last 8 years didn't happen. I'm not going to act like your behavior toward me was acceptable just because it was apparently part of some elaborate test." I looked around the room at the faces of people who had been my family for 8 years, some of whom were meeting my eyes for the first time with something approaching respect. "I need time to think about all of this," I continued. "About what your father expected me to do with this responsibility, and about what kind of relationship we're going to have going forward." I turned to Celia. "I think we should go home." She nodded, still looking stunned by everything that had transpired. As we prepared to leave, Muriel spoke for the first time since the reading had concluded. "Darian," she said, "I hope you'll remember that Rowick chose you not despite who you are, but because of who you are. Don't let our mistakes change that." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman, who had spent 8 years making me feel unwelcome in her home, who had just learned that I now owned that home and had the power to determine her financial future. "Mrs. Calvane," I said, "for the first time in 8 years I think we understand each other perfectly." As Celia and I walked out of the library and through the halls of what was now my house, I realized that inheriting $87 million was the easy part. The hard part would be deciding what kind of man I wanted to be with that kind of power, and whether I could find a way to honor Rowick's trust without losing myself in the process. The boy who had pulled a stranger from a burning car had just become one of the wealthiest men in the state, but the real test was just beginning. 3 days after the will reading, I sat in what had been Rowick's office at Calvane Enterprises, staring at financial documents that represented more money than I'd ever imagined existing in one place. The corner office on the 32nd floor of the Thornfield Financial Center had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, But I found myself looking at the numbers instead of the scenery. $87 million in liquid assets, controlling interest in 17 different companies, real estate holdings across 4 states, investment portfolios that generated more money in a month than I'd made in my best year at Brennan's Manufacturing. It was overwhelming, but not in the way I'd expected. The money itself felt abstract, like numbers on a screen rather than something real. What felt real was the responsibility that came with it. Safira Dreneth, the company's chief financial officer, had spent the morning walking me through the business operations with the kind of professional courtesy that couldn't quite hide her bewilderment at the situation. She was probably wondering how someone who'd been managing a manufacturing plant was going to handle decisions about international acquisitions and hedge fund investments. "The Morrison account that your father-in-law mentioned in the hospital," she was saying, consulting her tablet. "Theodore was supposed to finalize that deal today. It's a $23 million investment in renewable energy infrastructure. Has he done that?" "No, sir, he hasn't been in the office since the funeral. None of the family has." That didn't surprise me. I'd tried calling Theodore twice since the will reading, but he hadn't returned my calls. Alaya had answered when I called their house, but she'd claimed Theodore wasn't available and couldn't say when he would be. "What happens if the Morrison deal doesn't close today?" "We forfeit the deposit and the opportunity goes to our competitors. It would also damage our relationship with Morrison Industries, which could affect future partnerships." I looked at the contract details on her tablet. Renewable energy infrastructure was exactly the kind of forward-thinking investment that aligned with my own values about sustainable business practices. The numbers made sense, the timeline was reasonable, and the environmental impact would be positive. "Schedule a meeting with Morrison Industries for this afternoon," I said. "I'll handle the closing myself." Safira blinked. "Sir, with respect, this is an extremely complex deal. There are regulatory considerations, environmental impact assessments, legal compliance issues. Then I'll need you to bring me up to speed on all of those issues before the meeting." She studied my face, clearly trying to determine whether I was being recklessly overconfident or if I understood the magnitude of what I was proposing. "Mr. Holtcrest," she said carefully, "may I ask about your experience with this type of transaction?" "I have none," I said. "But I have 8 years of experience learning things quickly when the stakes are high, and I have access to expert advisors like you who can guide me through the details." Something in my tone must have convinced her that I was serious, because she straightened in her chair and adopted the focused expression of someone accepting a challenge. "In that case, we have 6 hours to make you conversant in renewable energy finance." By the time Morrison Industries arrived for the meeting, I'd absorbed more information about solar panel efficiency, wind turbine placement, and government energy subsidies than I'd thought possible. Safira had walked me through every aspect of the deal, from the initial environmental surveys to the projected return on investment over 15 years. James Morrison turned out to be a practical man in his 50s, who cared more about results than credentials. When I explained that I was stepping in to finalize the deal Theodore had been negotiating, he didn't seem concerned about my lack of experience. "Your father-in-law built this company on smart decisions and reliable partnerships," Morrison said as we shook hands. "If he trusted you to take over, that's good enough for me." The deal closed 2 hours later, with handshakes and signatures that committed $57 million to clean energy projects across 3 states. It was the largest business decision I'd ever made, and it felt exactly right. As Morrison's team left the office, Safira turned to me with an expression that might have been respect. "That was very well handled, sir. You asked exactly the right questions and pushed back on the financing terms in ways that saved us nearly $2 million. "I had a good teacher," I replied, "and motivation to prove that this transition can work." My phone buzzed with a text message from Celia. "Theodore is here. He wants to talk to you. He says it's urgent." I drove home to find Theodore's BMW parked in my driveway, which felt surreal given that I now owned the mansion where he'd grown up while he was visiting the modest house that Celia and I had purchased 3 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Theodore was sitting at my kitchen table, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, but looking somehow diminished in the domestic setting. Celia was across from him, her arms folded and her expression carefully neutral. "Darian," Theodore said, standing when I entered, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "Of course. Your family." He flinched slightly at the word family, and I realized he was probably wondering if that was still true given the dramatic shift in our circumstances. "I want to apologize," he said without preamble, "for the things I said at the will reading, and for the way I've treated you over the years. I was wrong." I gestured for him to sit back down and took the chair across from him. "Go on." "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about what our father wrote in that letter, about the testing, about what you proved by enduring our behavior for 8 years. He paused, looking uncomfortable with the admission he was about to make. "I don't think I would have passed that test." "What makes you say that?" "Because I've never had to prove myself to anyone. I've never had to choose between my pride and my principles, because my pride was never challenged. When you married Celia, I saw you as a threat to our family's status rather than an addition to our family's strength." He looked at Celia, then back at me. "I heard about the Morrison deal. Sapphira called me this afternoon." "And?" "And she said you handled it perfectly. Better than I would have, probably, because you asked questions I wouldn't have thought to ask, and challenged assumptions I would have accepted." I waited for him to continue. "The truth is, I've been coasting on our father's reputation and our family's connections my entire career. You've actually built something from nothing, learned skills through necessity rather than inheritance." He paused. "I was hoping you might consider letting me stay on at the company. Not in a leadership role, but in a position where I could learn how to actually earn my place rather than simply occupying it." It was the first time Theodore had ever spoken to me with genuine humility, and it was clearly costing him considerable effort. "What about Elia?" I asked. "How does she feel about this conversation?" Theodore's expression darkened. "Elia thinks I should contest the will. She believes there must have been undue influence, or mental incompetence, or some legal grounds for overturning our father's decision." "And you disagree?" "I disagree completely. Our father was the sharpest person I've ever known, right up until the day he died. If he chose you, he had good reasons." Theodore leaned forward. "But I need you to know that Aaliyah is consulting with attorneys. She's not going to accept this quietly." Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Ezra Merrow's office. "Excuse me," I said, answering the call. "Mr. Holtcrest," Ezra's voice was tense. "I'm afraid we have a problem. Mrs. Elia Calvane has filed a legal challenge to your inheritance. She's claiming that Mr. Calvane was mentally compromised when he made the changes to his will." I felt a cold anger beginning to build in my chest. On what grounds? "She's arguing that no rational person would leave such a substantial inheritance to someone outside the immediate family, and that the 8-year testing period described in the letter proves that Mr. Calvane was suffering from paranoid delusions about family loyalty." Theodore was watching my face, clearly able to tell from my expression that the conversation was about his wife's legal challenge. "What do we need to do?" I asked Ezra. "We need to demonstrate Mr. Calvane's mental competence through medical records, witness testimony, and documentation of his business decisions leading up to his death. The good news is that we have substantial evidence. The challenging news is that this could tie up the estate for months or even years." I thanked Ezra and ended the call, then turned to Theodore. "Your wife is trying to overturn your father's will." "I know," he said quietly. "I tried to talk her out of it." "And?" "And she told me I was being weak, that I was allowing myself to be manipulated by someone who had no right to our family's money." He looked down at his hands. "She said if I wasn't willing to fight for what was rightfully ours, she would do it herself." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where Celia and I had been genuinely happy for 3 years, a place where we'd never had to prove ourselves or navigate complex family politics. "Theodore," I said, turning back to face him, "I want you to understand something. Your father left me this inheritance because he believed I had the character to handle it responsibly. But he also gave me the authority to modify or revoke the other bequests if family members act against the family's interests." Theodore went pale. "You're talking about Elia's inheritance." "I'm talking about the fact that she's declared war on your father's final wishes. She's trying to overturn a carefully considered decision made by a man who built this fortune through decades of smart choices." I sat back down across from him. "Your father trusted me to protect his legacy. That includes protecting it from people who would tear the family apart to get what they think they deserve. What are you going to do?" I looked at Celia, who had been listening to this entire conversation with growing concern. She nodded slightly, and I realized she understood what I was considering. I'm going to call Ezra and revoke Alia's inheritance, I said. Every penny of it. And then I'm going to make sure she understands that actions have consequences. Theodore closed his eyes. She won't take that well. I'm sure she won't. But your father gave me this authority for exactly this reason. He knew that wealth could bring out the worst in people, and he wanted to make sure I could protect the family from that possibility. I pulled out my phone and called Ezra back. I want to exercise my authority to revoke Alia Calvain's inheritance, I said when he answered. All of it. The money, the jewelry, everything. Are you certain about this, Mr. Holtcrest? Once we file this paperwork, it will be very difficult to reverse. I'm certain, and I want it done today. When I ended the call, Theodore was staring at me with something that might have been awe. In one afternoon, you've closed a $23 million business deal and stripped my wife of her inheritance, he said. Our father was right about you. What do you mean? He used to say that the most dangerous person in any negotiation was someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Theodore smiled sadly. I think Alia is about to learn what that means. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with another call. This time the caller ID showed Alia's name. Hello, Alia, I answered. You bastard, she said without preamble. You think you can steal our family's money and then punish us for fighting back? I think your father-in-law made a decision about his own money, and you're trying to overturn it through legal intimidation. This isn't over, Darian. I have lawyers, I have connections, and I have resources you can't imagine. Actually, I said, you don't have resources anymore. I just revoked your inheritance. All of it. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. You can't do that, she said finally. I can, and I did. It's already filed with the court. I kept my voice calm and professional. Your husband is sitting across from me right now, by the way. He tried to talk you out of this legal challenge, but you chose to proceed anyway. Theodore? Her voice was sharp with betrayal. You're with him? I'm where I should have been all along, Theodore said loudly enough for her to hear. With my family. The call ended abruptly. Theodore and I sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing what had just happened. So, Theodore said finally, I guess this is what it looks like when the tables turn completely. I nodded. For 8 years, I'd been the outsider trying to prove myself worthy of acceptance. Now I was the one with the power to determine who belonged and who didn't. It was a reversal so complete that it felt almost surreal. But as I looked across the table at Theodore, really looked at him for the first time without the filter of his past condescension, I realized that the real test wasn't how I handled having power over people who had treated me poorly. The real test was whether I could use that power to build something better than what had existed before. The man who had pulled Celia from that overturned car 8 years ago had been driven by an instinct to help someone in need. Now I had to decide whether the man who controlled the Calvain family fortune would be driven by the same instinct, or by the desire for revenge that would have been so easy to justify. Rawick Calvain had tested my character for 8 years. Now it was time to find out what I'd learned from that test. The Thornfield Business Association's annual charity gala was the kind of event the Calvain family had attended for decades. Held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, it brought together the city's most influential business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists for an evening of networking disguised as charitable giving. Rawick had served on the association's board for 15 years, and the family's attendance had always been considered mandatory. This year would be different. This year I would be attending as the new owner of Calvain Enterprises, representing the family's business interests for the first time. Muriel had called 3 days earlier to suggest that my presence would be important for maintaining the company's relationships within the business community. People will be watching, she'd said. They'll want to see how you handle yourself in Rawick's position. She was right, of course. In the week since Alia's legal challenge had become public knowledge, the business community had been buzzing with speculation about the Calvain family succession. Some were questioning whether I had the experience to manage such substantial holdings. Others were curious about the family dynamics that had led to such an unexpected inheritance. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion about whether Rawick Calvain had made a wise decision or a catastrophic mistake. Celia and I arrived at the Grand Meridian in the black Mercedes that had been Rawick's personal vehicle. I'd considered taking our own car, but Sapphira had pointed out that appearances mattered in business circles, and arriving in the recognized Calvane family vehicle would send a message about continuity and confidence. The hotel's ballroom was exactly as I'd expected: crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and an atmosphere of refined wealth that felt both familiar and foreign after 8 years of attending Calvane family events. But tonight was different. Tonight, I wasn't the outsider being grudgingly tolerated. Tonight, I was representing one of the city's most prominent business families. We were greeted at the entrance by Margaret Linthorne, the association's president and a longtime family friend. She was a woman in her 60s who had known Rowick since his early days in business, and her greeting would set the tone for how others perceived my new role. "Darian," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight. Rowick spoke of you often, and always with great respect." I felt Celia squeeze my arm gently. Margaret's words were more than mere politeness. They were a public endorsement of my legitimacy and Rowick's position. "Thank you, Margaret. Rowick spoke highly of you as well. He always said the association's success was largely due to your leadership." We moved into the cocktail reception, and I immediately noticed the subtle shift in how people approached us. Instead of the polite but distant acknowledgments I'd received at previous events, business leaders were actively seeking introductions. The Morrison deal had apparently made an impression, and word of my decisive handling of family business matters had spread through the community's informal networks. "Darian Holtcrest," a voice called from behind me. I turned to see James Morrison approaching with 2 other men I didn't recognize. "I'd like you to meet David Fenwick, from Fenwick Construction, and Robert Stravick from Meridian Holdings. We were just discussing the renewable energy project." The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd experienced at these events. Instead of being introduced as Celia's husband, or relegated to discussions about weather and sports, I found myself in the center of substantive business conversations. David Fenwick was interested in potential partnerships for sustainable construction projects. Robert Stravick wanted to discuss investment opportunities in emerging technologies. "Your approach to the Morrison deal was impressive," Fenwick said. "Most people in your position would have let Theodore handle it, maintained the status quo. Taking personal responsibility for a $23 million transaction shows real leadership. It also shows confidence in your decision-making abilities," Stravick added. "That kind of deal requires understanding complex regulatory frameworks and long-term market projections." I was explaining my perspective on renewable energy investments when I noticed a commotion near the ballroom entrance. Alaya had arrived, accompanied by a man I didn't recognize who had the polished look of an expensive attorney. She was wearing a stunning black dress and diamond jewelry that caught the light as she moved, clearly intending to make an impression. Theodore was noticeably absent. "Excuse me for a moment," I said to the group, then walked with Celia toward where Alaya was holding court near the registration table. "Darian," Margaret Linthorne appeared at my elbow. "I understand there's been some family difficulty regarding Rowick's estate." News traveled fast in Thornfield's business community. "There have been some legal challenges, yes. I hope you know that the association fully supports your leadership of Calvane Enterprises. Rowick's judgment was always impeccable, and if he chose you as his successor, that endorsement carries considerable weight with our membership." Before I could respond, Alaya's voice cut across the room. "It's tragic, really," she was saying to a small group of people who had gathered around her. "Watching someone take advantage of an elderly man's generosity and confusion." The conversations around us began to quiet as people sensed drama unfolding. "Rowick was such a trusting soul," Alaya continued, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "He never imagined that someone might manipulate their way into our family for financial gain." I felt the blood rise to my face, but before I could respond, an unexpected voice spoke up. "Alaya Calvane, that's quite enough." Dr. Harrison Velthar, Rowick's personal physician for over 20 years, had emerged from the crowd. He was a distinguished man in his 70s who commanded respect throughout the medical community. "Dr. Velthar," Alaya said, clearly surprised by his intervention. "I didn't know you were here tonight." "I've attended this gala for 30 years, he replied calmly. "And in all that time I've never heard such shameful behavior from a member of one of our founding families." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving around the edges of the gathering. "Dr. Velthar," Alaya said, attempting to recover her composure, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about my father-in-law's mental state in his final years." There's no misunderstanding, Dr. Velthar interrupted firmly. I examined Rowick Calvane 3 weeks before his death for his annual physical. His cognitive function was perfect, his memory was sharp, his decision-making capacity was completely intact. He paused, looking directly at Aaliyah. I've already provided that medical assessment to his attorney, by the way. Aaliyah's face went pale, but Dr. Velthar wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, I was present for several conversations between Rowick and his attorney over the past 2 years as they planned his estate distribution. He spent considerable time discussing his reasoning, and his decision to leave his fortune to Darian was deliberate, thoughtful, and based on 8 years of careful observation. Margaret Linthorne stepped forward. Dr. Velthar, are you saying that Mr. Calvane's inheritance decision was thoroughly considered? I'm saying that Rowick Calvane made the most carefully reasoned decision of his life, Dr. Velthar replied. He told me personally that Darian had proven himself to be the kind of man who could be trusted with both wealth and responsibility. The silence in the room was profound. I could see people exchanging glances, processing this information, and its implications for their own relationships with the Calvane family business. But Dr. Velthar still wasn't finished. What I find most disturbing, he said, his voice carrying across the entire ballroom, is the suggestion that Darian somehow manipulated his way into this inheritance. I've watched this young man for 8 years at family gatherings and social events. I've seen how the Calvane family treated him. My stomach dropped. I hadn't realized that Dr. Velthar had been observing the family dynamics during social events. I've watched him endure condescension and exclusion with remarkable grace. Dr. Velthar continued. I've seen him treated as lesser than, dismissed and humiliated, while maintaining his dignity and his commitment to his wife and her family. Celia's hand found mine and squeezed tightly. I've watched him work multiple jobs while pursuing his education, building a consulting business while managing family obligations, and proving his worth year after year to people who seemed determined not to see it. Dr. Velthar's voice was growing stronger. If anyone manipulated this situation, it wasn't Darian. It was the family members who spent 8 years testing his character while pretending to judge it. The impact of these words on the gathered crowd was visible. Business leaders who had known the Calvane family for decades were looking at me with new understanding. They were realizing that my inheritance wasn't the result of manipulation or luck, but the outcome of nearly a decade of character evaluation by one of the sharpest minds in the business community. Dr. Velthar, Elias said desperately, surely you understand that family assets should remain within the family. Darian is family, Dr. Velthar said simply. He became family the moment he risked his life to save Celia 8 years ago, and he's proven that commitment every day since. The question isn't whether he deserves this inheritance. The question is whether the rest of you deserve to benefit from the wealth he'll build with it. Margaret Linthorne cleared her throat. I think we should allow the family to handle their private matters privately, she said diplomatically, but the damage to Elias' position was already done. As conversation slowly resumed around the room, I found myself surrounded by business leaders who wanted to shake my hand and express their confidence in my leadership. The story of my 8-year testing period, combined with Dr. Velthar's passionate defense of my character, had transformed me from a questionable inheritor into a man who had earned his position through extraordinary circumstances. Darian, James Morrison said, appearing at my side, I'd like to discuss expanding our partnership. After hearing Dr. Velthar's account, I'm even more convinced that you're exactly the kind of business leader this community needs. Similar conversations followed throughout the evening. David Fenwick proposed a joint venture for sustainable housing development. Robert Stravick offered to introduce me to technology entrepreneurs he'd been mentoring. Margaret Linthorne asked if I'd consider joining the association's board of directors. But the most meaningful moment came near the end of the evening, when Marielle approached me near the coat check. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Not for the testing. I still believe that was necessary, but for the pain we caused you along the way. Mrs. Calvane. Marielle, she corrected. And I want you to know that watching you tonight, seeing how you've handled both the business responsibilities and the family crisis, I finally understand what Rowick saw in you. She paused, looking around the room where business leaders were still engaged in animated conversations about the evening's revelations. He didn't just leave you his money, Darian, he left you his reputation, and tonight you've proven that you were worthy of both. As Celia and I drove home later that evening, I reflected on how completely the narrative had shifted. 6 months ago, I'd been the factory worker who'd gotten lucky enough to marry above his station. Tonight, I'd been publicly validated as a business leader who'd earned his position through character and perseverance. Dr. Velthar was amazing, Celia said. I had no idea he'd been watching all those family interactions. Neither did I, but I'm grateful he spoke up. Are you? She asked. I mean, did you want everyone to know about how badly my family treated you? I considered the question carefully. I wanted people to understand that your father's decision wasn't arbitrary or manipulated. If that meant revealing the family dynamics, then yes, I wanted that truth to come out. And Alaya? Alaya made her choice when she decided to attack your father's final wishes publicly. Tonight was just the consequence of that choice. As we pulled into our driveway, I realized that the public vindication I'd experienced tonight was more satisfying than any private revenge could have been. The business community now understood not just that I'd inherited the Calvain fortune, but that I'd earned it through years of proving my character under the most challenging circumstances. Tomorrow, I would continue building on Rowick's legacy with the full support and respect of Thornfield's business leaders. But tonight, I was simply grateful that the man who'd risked everything to save a stranger 8 years ago had finally been recognized for who he truly was. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room at Calvain Enterprises, looking out at the faces of our senior management team as we reviewed the quarterly results. The numbers told a story of growth and innovation that would have made Rowick proud. The renewable energy division had exceeded projections by 30%. Our sustainable manufacturing initiatives had attracted 3 major new clients. The technology investments Theodore had recommended were showing promising returns. Theodore sat at my right hand, no longer the entitled heir apparent, but a valued team member who had earned his position through competence and dedication. The transformation in his approach to work had been remarkable. Without the safety net of guaranteed inheritance, he'd discovered a work ethic and business acumen that had been dormant for years. The Morrison partnership is opening doors we never anticipated, Theodore was saying as he presented the quarterly overview. Their referrals have led to 4 additional contracts in renewable infrastructure, totaling $68 million in new business. Safira nodded approvingly. The profit margins on these projects are substantially higher than our traditional holdings. Mr. Holtcrest's decision to pivot towards sustainable industries has positioned us ahead of market trends. After the meeting concluded, Theodore remained behind as the others filed out. I wanted to thank you, he said, for giving me the chance to prove myself. You earned it, I replied. Your father was right about your potential. You just needed the right motivation to access it. About Alaya, he said, his expression growing somber. The divorce was finalized last week. I nodded. Theodore had filed for divorce 3 months after the charity gala, when it became clear that Alaya was more committed to fighting the inheritance than to rebuilding their marriage. I'm sorry it came to that. I'm not, he said simply. She showed me who she really was when the money disappeared. That's not someone I want to build a life with. As Theodore left the office, I reflected on how dramatically our family dynamic had changed. Without the toxic influence of Alaya's ambition and entitlement, the remaining family members had found a way to function as an actual family rather than a collection of competing interests. Muriel had become an invaluable advisor on community relations and philanthropic initiatives. Her social connections and diplomatic skills had helped smooth the transition as I took on Rowick's role in various civic organizations. More importantly, she'd become the mother-in-law I'd always hoped to have, treating me with genuine respect and affection. Celia had flourished in ways I hadn't expected. With the family conflicts resolved and our financial future secure, she'd returned to school to pursue the art therapy degree she'd abandoned years earlier. Her passion for helping trauma survivors heal through creative expression had given her a sense of purpose that went beyond managing inherited wealth. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Velthar. Lunch tomorrow. I have a proposition for you. That lunch led to the Calvain Foundation's medical research initiative, funding studies on trauma recovery and emergency medical response. It felt like the perfect way to honor both Rowick's memory and the experience that had brought Celia and me together. But the most meaningful change had been in how I viewed myself. For 8 years, I defined my worth by how well I could prove myself to people who seemed determined not to see my value. Now I understood that worth isn't something you prove to others. It's something you demonstrate through your choices when no one is watching. The evening before the Foundation's first annual fundraising dinner, I found myself back in Rowick's study, reading through his personal papers and trying to understand the man who had shaped my life so profoundly through his elaborate test. In a leather journal tucked behind his business files, I found an entry dated just 3 months before his death. Watched Darian help an elderly woman with her groceries in the hospital parking lot today while waiting for Muriel's appointment. He had no idea I could see him from the window. Same instinct that made him stop for Celia 8 years ago. Character isn't performance, it's reflex. He's ready for what's coming. I closed the journal and looked around the study that had become my workspace. The books and awards that had once intimidated me now felt like tools I was privileged to inherit. The responsibility that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like an opportunity to build something meaningful. The next evening, as I stood before 300 guests at the Foundation's inaugural dinner, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The factory worker who had pulled a stranger from a burning car had become a business leader capable of directing millions toward causes that mattered. The man who had endured years of humiliation had learned to use power with wisdom rather than vindictiveness. 8 years ago, I told the gathered crowd, a car accident changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Tonight, we're launching an initiative that will help other people survive their own life-changing moments and rebuild stronger than before. As applause filled the ballroom, I caught sight of Celia at our table, her face glowing with pride and love. Beside her sat Muriel and Theodore, no longer the family that had tested me, but the family that had chosen me. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving your worth to people who doubted you. Sometimes it's discovering that your worth was never in question. You just needed the right circumstances to see it clearly. The man who had risked everything to save a stranger had learned that kindness is always the right choice, even when it takes 8 years for the reward to become apparent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.